Some of you may have seen the response I did on Second Thought in relation to do with capitalism.
We're going to try something new in this episode. I talk a lot about the problems of capitalism and the challenges we face. As important as that kind of analysis is, it can make socialists like me come off as very negative people.
When it comes to socialists, they are very negative-minded. They're very pessimistic. You only have to listen to these, socialist college students. Everything's a problem. They're always looking for grievances in absolutely everything. So, yes, of course.
So, in this video, I'm going to talk about what makes socialism a positive worldview, and suggest that you might already be a socialist and just not know it yet.
I would actually argue with that. I would say people are more capitalist-minded than what they think they are. What I mean by that is capitalism in relation today with individual self-interest and stuff like that. People are more self-interested and it's part and parcel of human nature. Now you could take, for example, the contradiction you've seen in France. France is a very socialist-minded country. They were crying out for the higher tax rates, and as soon as they got the higher tax rates, they rebel against it. Socialists are constantly contradictory, and you see this with these champagne socialists. These people claim to be all for sharing and all the rest of it, but when it comes to their own possessions, their own money, etc., they won't do it.
Before we begin, let me ask one small favor of you, the viewer. If you're watching this in the US, there's a very high likelihood that you have a negative opinion of the word socialism. You might change your mind. And even if you don't, you'll at least have a better understanding of what socialism actually means than if you just hear the term misused on TV.
Again, this is just nonsense, because when you look at the whole thing down to theory and practice, he's trying to define socialism around theory. Even if they were to go down the road and say, oh, well, it's in the hands of the community as a whole, the problem that they've got is they confuse their intentions and goals, and they don't understand consequences. So they don't understand the difference between theory and practice. It's all well you having your theories, the theory of how it's supposed to turn out, but they don't realise that economic reality defies them, because they don't even understand economics. Take, for example, prices. Like I've explained many times before, and you can watch my videos on the economic calculation problem, they've not even got a clue what prices are. Prices are signals. See, if you've not got the information of prices, there's no way for you to be able to operate an economy efficiently. It's the very reason why the NHS is in the mess that it's in. Folk just think it's a case of just pouring more and more money into it, as if that's going to fix the problem. It's not going to fix anything. Again, you could even look at, human nature. Like I say, human nature is self-interested. Socialism defies that. And you could go on about these regimes and say, oh, they weren't really truly socialist. They never really tried socialism. It's just nonsense. Of course they tried it. The reason why they turned out dictatorial is not because, they failed socialism, it's because that's the natural state of it in practice.
I'm using the term socialism very broadly here, as a sort of catch-all for generally leftist thought. This episode is more for the people who are interested in learning what distinguishes the left from typical American capitalist perspectives.
A lot of folk don't even understand what capitalism is, and that's the harsh truth of the matter. A lot of folk seem to think that capitalism is about supporting this mixed economy just because there's a private sector or something like that. Capitalism is the free market economy, and I've lost count the amount of folk who oppose the free market and think the sky would cave in if we had a free market. They say, oh, we need to protect ourselves from the extremes of capitalism, but I support capitalism. Well, no, you don't. If you oppose the free market economy, you're basically in opposition against the capitalist system.
I think we should start with the distinction between liberals and the left. This is something that trips up a lot of people, and it doesn't help that the media seems to use the two terms interchangeably. Let's start with what the two camps have in common. Both leftists and liberals care about democratic governance and believe in universal human rights.
Again, it's the whole thing today with the beliefs in the theory and practice. What you don't seem to understand is the universal human rights. When you talk about negative rights, you've got the right to agree to disagree with one another. That's in relation today with capitalism. It's, of course, equal rights. But what you support and your belief is today with positive rights. It's unequal rights. Again, you're faced with the dire consequences as a result of your so-called good intentions. Let's say, for example, you say a job is a human right, but the problem is you're placing the rights of so-called one group, which is the employee or the employer, because you're taking away the right for the employer to sack them. That's no equal. It doesn't matter if you try to swerve around the argument or even try to call me names or whatever you want to do. like every socialist tries to do. It's all this thing to do with theory and practice, even when you talk about the democratic governance. Where have you ever seen socialism being democratic? Never in human history. Even from what Christian Niemiec points out in his book, Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies, every time the honeymoon phase came around, the socialists were, very outspoken and boastful and gleeful of their, socialist regime. They would call it democratic. They even went as far as to call the Soviet Union a dictatorship, by the way, a totalitarian dictatorship. And they even dared in the 1930s, during its honeymoon phase, they says that it was so democratic. I wouldn't need to be alive in order to know that, because they did the exact same thing when it came to Venezuela. Venezuela, during its honeymoon phase, during the oil boom between 1998 to 2008, these socialists were like, oh, how democratic and wonderful, oh, how the world should look to Venezuela. Whilst they were saying that, they were faced with food shortages and blackouts and all sorts, and you're kind of thinking to yourself, you must be right off your nut. And then, of course, the failure after the honeymoon phase, the failure becomes so widespread to a point that it's too impossible for them even stare past, and then they start denying it. They start saying, oh well, it wasn't socialist. Again, I'm not going to go down the whole argument, with this whole thing where money comes from and all the rest of that. I've already argued there's only two places: the private sector, the printing press. You've got no choice. I mean, if you've not got a private sector, where are you going to get the money for? The manager, it just happens to be the government. See, when government destroys the information of profits and losses, I'll quickly state this: the governments no longer get the information to know where to allocate resources, what to produce more, because it's no got the information of profits and losses. So if it's no got that information, how the hell is the government supposed to know, the people's needs and wants? It doesn't have that information. That's why J. Douglas of the Labour Party, a so-called democratic socialist politician, came out and says himself in his own words, the gentlemen of Whitehall really do know what's best for the British people, and the British people do themselves. In other words, try to tell us that the central planner somehow knows better for us than what we do. And that's always been the case. That's been the true face of socialism throughout history.
But liberals, contrary to what many conservative news figures will tell you, still put their faith in capitalist market-based economics.
I hate this nonsense, and it's just like his previous video on the whole thing to do with capitalism. He was describing corporatism and he doesn't even realise it. Today's United States of America isn't capitalist. When's that penny going to drop? It isn't capitalist. You turned your back on capitalism well over 100 years ago. How can you be capitalist when your private sector's all regulated? And if it's no that, you're faced with all these government subsidies. And if it's not faced with all the government subsidies, you're faced with a central banking system controlling and manipulating interest rates and the reserve ratios. Where's your gold and silver? Exactly, because you've not got free market money. You're not a free market economy. So you're not a capitalist economy. You're anti-capitalist.
They believe that the problems in our capitalist society stem from corrupt individuals. And if we simply root out these bad actors and pursue incremental reform, the system can function properly.
If they're talking about just replacing politicians and stuff like that, they're sadly mistaken, and that isn't capitalism. Replacing politicians, that's not going to do anything. You're living under corporatism. We've got recorded history there to speak for itself. The world's most successful economies have all been those that have been strongly free from government intervention. That's been the case. You've seen it between 1870 and 1960 in Sweden. You've seen it in Hong Kong between 1948 and 1997. You've seen it in Singapore for a good number of decades since the 1950s. You've seen it in Chile when they freed up their economy to a varying degree, the early 1980s to about 2006. Right, it's not like we haven't got the evidence there. We've got the evidence. You've not really got a leg to stand on. Whereas with your argument with socialism, you've not got any historical examples. What have you got? All you've got is socialism that's always been dictatorial. And like I says, the examples of the Paris Commune, the Ukraine Free Territory, anarchist Catalonia, they were anything but libertarian.
Leftists have a different perspective. They believe that the problems we face are inherent to capitalism, and that the system is functioning exactly how it's supposed to. The left sees the problems identified by liberals not as problems within capitalism, but as a byproduct of a properly functioning capitalist machine.
We see that's the issue, because socialists haven't got a clue about economics. Take, for example, the controlling and manipulating of the interest rates that caused the boom in bus cycle. Now, capitalism's about leaving interest rates be to the free market so that the laws of supply and demand determine what your interest rates are. When you talk about the mixed economy, it's the mixture between capitalism and socialism. We might not be living under a full-blown socialist economy or a capitalist system. Socialism has to have its presence somewhere to some degree, and since we know that capitalism's today with the free market, and today with that of the freedom in the marketplace, controls or things like prices, interest rates, the reserve ratios, etc. All of that is socialism. That's how you can identify what socialism is within the mixed economy. So when you started controlling interest rates and caused the boom in bus cycle, you then projected the blame and blamed it off onto capitalism. It's all well saying, oh well, us socialists have identified the problems. No, you haven't. All you've done is basically blamed the wrong thing. Since when did capitalism, with the freedom of interest rates left be to the laws of supply and demand, since when did capitalism cause the boom in bus cycle of the 20th century? Never. So you've not identified the problem at all. So there we have a prime example of socialists suffering from narcissistic personality disorder, where they love to project the blame off onto somebody else and then never take responsibility for their own actions. You try to blame capitalism for it's no the fault of capitalism at all, and then you arrogantly try to tell people that you've sussed the issue out. No, you haven't, because you haven't even got a clue about economics to begin with. How can you blame capitalism for things you don't even understand what capitalism is?
Capitalism cannot solve the problems it creates because that would impede growth. So leftists believe that we need to move beyond capitalism in favor of a better system. One of the most important distinctions to make between liberals and the left is that the left is concerned primarily with materialism. That is, the material realities of people's lives. Let's take an example policy proposal: student debt cancellation. For a liberal, canceling even $1,000 of debt would be a huge symbolic victory. For a socialist, the amount canceled and the total amount of indebtedness are less important than most people's more immediate concern: being able to pay the installment every month.
It's other policies that led to the very mess with the serious debt crisis. Take, for example, their support of social security, the largest contributing factor to the serious debt crisis. Free healthcare, free education. Again, it's all this stuff, all the good intentions in the world, but the consequences, because they don't understand that for face value, it might look free. For face value, it might seem more affordable, but it's not. It ends up more expensive. They end up in the sort of economy where there's a lack of opportunity because of all their policies. And it's no different with the rest of the socialists. You're talking about this today with finances and money. Money only comes from two places: the private sector or the printing press. Take your choice. Are you going to run the economy, finance it by the private sector, which is the only rational way that you can do so, or are you going to turn to the printing press, which is basically just going to drive you right into hyperinflation? What do you think inflation is? You inflate the size of a balloon. Well, it's no different with the size of the currency. You keep printing. The quantity of that paper keeps on growing, and of course, the less the value of the currency holds, less you can buy with it. So of course, you're going to go right down the road to hyperinflation. It's all your good intentions. You're faced with the consequences of your actions, because what happens when inflation soars out of control? Prices of goods and services soar out of control. So then you're faced with a serious problem. The poor have just get poorer as a result of it. So what you going to do to try to fix that problem? You're going to try and get government into, set down some sort of higher minimum wage or something? Or are you going to get government into set down price ceilings? This is exactly what happened in 1974 under Ted Heath. He tried to react against the inflationary crisis, setting down price ceilings, and that created a shortage at the pump in 1974. See, this is a sad thing. I'm actually giving you a prime example in history of what happened under your so-called prolonged testing of democratic socialism in Great Britain. And like Thatcher stated, it was a miserable failure in every respect. Of course, if you've not got a private sector to finance your economy, how else are you going to finance it? I mean, the private sector was bled dry, so the taxpayer couldn't afford it. See, the reality is they were running the printing press and were driving towards hyperinflation. We were lucky enough to avoid it, because Thatcher sold off the oil industry in order to save us. Again, it's those consequences. I'm giving you a historical example. You can't even do that. You're not even capable of doing that.
The material reality for most students is the challenge of affording the monthly payment. If that challenge is not addressed, then the policy does not materially improve that person's life, and is therefore insufficient. Let's take another example: Medicare for all. This is a big one for the left because making healthcare free at the point of service would have an immediate and enormous material impact on the average person's life.
You know, I was born into the NHS, and the NHS here is treated like a religious institution. That's honestly what it's treated like. Despite the fact that even for one type of cancer, never mind every other, sort of cancer you can think of, more than 9,000 people die each year needlessly in Britain who suffer from one type of cancer because they're neglected as a result of the NHS. And we're not even talking about every other type of cancer and heart disease treatment and all the rest of it. Now, the NHS since the 1950s, and in fact since its inception, has been faced with the long waiting lines, thousands left in neglect every single year as a result. Yeah, faced with the hospital bed shortages, the medical staff shortages, and every single decade, every single year, it's the same old excuses. Between 2010 to 2020, this year, they use up the excuses and say, oh, the NHS is just underfunded. It's the same old excuses, on and on and on. We've heard it on and on and on. That's why I say to American folk, you need to fight for your life to prevent your country ever going down the road of universal healthcare. Because see, once it's put in place, these folk will literally brush every known failure right under the carpet, because as far as they're concerned, they're no interested in that. All they're interested in is their religious ideology, and that's it. And it's the same thing with this universal healthcare, the free at the point of use. What a load of nonsense. You know what the free at the point of use means? It means you've basically destroyed the information of profits and losses. How can you have profits and losses if you've set it down to free at the point of use? How else do you think the NHS is a pile of shit? It's never worked. Not one single year has the NHS worked. Every single year in record it's been inefficient.
If you can afford to go to the doctor, you could literally be extending your life by having access to the medicine you need.
Well, there's the issue. You've just said that it's about the costs. So if folk can afford healthcare, then it'd be much better for you. Well, why don't you look up direct primary care then, based off a free market model? Because it contradicts your narrative. The American healthcare market's in the mess that it's in because of all your socialism. That wasn't the fault of capitalism. It had nothing at all to do with the private sector. I love you socialists. You create a problem and then you project the blame off onto what was never the cause of the problem. You literally over-regulated the private sector. You then had the AMA monopoly. You then created your socialist third-party payer system. And then, after you did all that, you then say, oh, well, it's because of private ownership. Seriously?
For liberals, they'd be happy with a program that kind of covers some people but only under certain circumstances, and private healthcare has to stay, of course. And then when they pass that bill, they consider it a huge victory. Same with race relations. The liberals are content to kneel in traditional African garb and paint Black Lives Matter over a street, but they fail to address any of the actual material concerns of the Black Lives Matter movement.
To be fair to those type of people who support the private sector and do not take them seriously, then I'm very grateful for that, because if you were to actually take the concerns of these people, such as the Black Lives Matter organisation, which is a Marxist organisation, if you were to take them seriously, then you would be in deep trouble. The economy would be in serious trouble. It's in bad enough state as it is, but the fact that you think that somehow socialism's going to work for you, you're having a laugh. I mean, he even says about financing. How are you going to do that without the private sector? I mean, you're out your mind.